You're just a temp, be quiet! Boss snapped at Black Janitor, unaware she was an industry expert. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Naomi Carter pushed her cart down the sterile hallway of Pinnacle Manufacturing. The wheels squeaked with each rotation, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 3 weeks. At 38, she moved with quiet efficiency, her dark hands gripping the handle of the mop as she navigated between the bustling employees who barely acknowledged her presence. "Morning, Naomi," whispered Sarah from accounting, one of the few people who bothered to learn her name. Sarah always spoke in hushed tones when greeting her, as if afraid someone might notice her kindness toward the help. "Good morning, Sarah," Naomi replied with a gentle smile, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed out of place in the cold, industrial setting. She noticed how Sarah's eyes darted nervously around before she hurried away, clutching her coffee cup like a shield. The morning routine was always the same. Clean the executive offices before the bigwigs arrived, empty the trash cans that overflowed with crumpled papers and discarded dreams, and remain invisible. That was the unspoken rule in places like this. Janitorial staff were meant to be seen but not heard, present but not acknowledged. As Naomi entered the production floor, the familiar sound of machinery filled her ears. Workers in hard hats moved about their duties, some nodding politely in her direction. She had learned their names, their stories, their struggles. There was Marcus, a 22-year-old trying to support his young family. Elena, a single mother working double shifts to pay for her daughter's college tuition. These people saw her, really saw her, unlike the management who looked through her as if she were made of glass. "Carter!" The voice boomed across the floor like thunder, causing several workers to flinch. Richard Hale strode toward her with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. At 45, he wore his authority like an expensive suit, perfectly tailored and impossible to ignore. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, and his cold blue eyes held the kind of disdain usually reserved for something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of one's shoe. "Yes, Mr. Hale?" Naomi straightened, setting down her cleaning supplies. She had perfected the art of appearing respectfully attentive, while internally cataloging every detail of these interactions. "The client bathrooms on the 3rd floor are a disgrace," he barked, his voice carrying across the production floor. Several workers pretended to be busy while obviously listening. "I don't know what kind of cleaning standards you people are used to, but this is a professional establishment." Naomi felt the familiar sting of his words, but her expression remained neutral. "I cleaned those bathrooms yesterday evening, Mr. Hale. Perhaps if you could specify what—" "Don't give me excuses," Richard interrupted, his face reddening. "Just fix it. And next time, do it right the first time. We're not running a charity here." The words hung in the air like toxic fumes. Naomi watched as the nearby workers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Marcus shook his head in disgust, while Elena looked away, her jaw clenched with suppressed anger. "Of course, Mr. Hale," Naomi replied quietly. "I'll take care of it immediately." As she gathered her supplies, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Near Station 7, where they processed the chemical treatments, she spotted a small but significant leak in one of the secondary containment systems. The colorless liquid was barely visible, but Naomi's trained eye caught the telltale shimmer against the concrete floor. Her heart raced as she realized the implications. That leak, small as it was, could contaminate the entire water system if it reached the storm drains. The environmental impact would be catastrophic, not to mention the potential health hazards for the workers who spent 8 hours a day breathing the air in this facility. "Mr. Hale," she called out, her voice urgent but respectful. "I need to show you something important." Richard turned around, his expression already showing irritation at being addressed again. "What now, Carter? I thought I made it clear that you have work to do." "There's a chemical leak at Station 7, she said, pointing toward the area. "It's small now, but if it's not contained soon, it could. You're just a temp, be quiet." Richard snapped, his voice echoing off the metal walls. The entire production floor seemed to freeze. Even the machinery seemed to quiet for a moment, as if shocked by the venom in his voice. Naomi felt the words hit her like a physical blow. Around her, she could see the workers' faces reflecting a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and helplessness. She had become the target of their boss's cruelty, and there was nothing any of them could do about it. "I understand your concern about the schedule, Mr. Hale," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But this is a safety issue that could affect everyone in this building." Richard stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that made several nearby workers shift uncomfortably. His expensive cologne couldn't mask the smell of entitlement and arrogance that seemed to emanate from his very pores. "Listen to me very carefully, Carter," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You push a mop and empty trash cans. That's it. You don't think, you don't analyze, and you certainly don't give advice to your betters. If there was a real problem, my qualified engineers would have spotted it. Now, are you going to do your job, or do I need to call the temp agency and have them send someone who understands their place?" The silence that followed was deafening. Naomi could feel the eyes of every worker on the floor boring into her, waiting to see how she would respond. She saw Marcus clench his fists, his protective instincts warring with the knowledge that speaking up would cost him his job. Elena looked ready to cry, her own experiences with workplace humiliation clearly reflected in her expression. "I'll get back to work, Mr. Hale," Naomi said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Richard replied with a satisfied smirk. "And Carter? Next time you feel the urge to play expert, remember that there's a reason you're cleaning up after your betters instead of sitting in their chairs." As he walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete floor, Naomi bent down to pick up her cleaning supplies. Her hands were shaking now, but not from fear or humiliation. They were shaking with the effort it took to maintain her composure when every instinct screamed at her to reveal exactly who she was and what she was capable of. She caught Elena's eye and saw the older woman mouth, "I'm sorry," across the space between them. Marcus gave her a subtle thumbs up, his way of showing support without risking his own job. These small gestures of solidarity meant more to her than Richard would ever understand. As Naomi made her way to the third floor, her mind was already working. Richard Hale had just revealed more about his character in 5 minutes than most people showed in 5 months. His complete dismissal of a legitimate safety concern, his casual cruelty in front of subordinates, and his obvious belief that worth was determined by job title rather than competence, it all went into her mental file. But as she climbed the stairs, pushing her cart with its squeaky wheel, Naomi allowed herself a small, secret smile. Richard Hale thought he knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. He had no idea how wrong he was, and by the time he figured it out, it would be far too late. The chemical leak at Station 7 continued to spread, drop by invisible drop, while the man responsible for worker safety remained blissfully unaware of the danger his arrogance had just created. 3 days had passed since the incident at Station 7, and Richard Hale seemed to have developed a taste for humiliating Naomi Carter. It was as if her attempt to help had awakened something cruel in him, a need to remind her, and everyone else, exactly where she stood in the company hierarchy. Well, look what we have here," Richard announced loudly as he entered the break room where Naomi was quietly eating her lunch. The room, which had been filled with the comfortable chatter of workers, fell silent. "Our resident genius is taking a break from her demanding intellectual work." Naomi looked up from her sandwich, noting how the other employees suddenly became very interested in their phones or their food. She had learned to recognize this pattern, Richard's need for an audience when he performed his little cruelty shows. "Just having lunch, Mr. Hale," she replied calmly, though internally she was cataloging every word, every gesture, every witness to his behavior. "In the employee break room?" Richard's voice dripped with mock surprise. "I thought temp workers ate in their cars or something. You know, somewhere more appropriate to your status." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his knuckles white as he gripped his coffee cup. Elena kept her eyes fixed on her salad, but Naomi could see the tension in her shoulders. These people cared about her, and watching her humiliation was painful for them too. "I was under the impression that all employees could use this space during break time," Naomi said carefully. She knew she was walking a tightrope. Respond too weakly and Richard would push harder. Respond too strongly and she'd risk her cover. Employees, yes. Richard laughed, and the sound was sharp and ugly. But you're not really an employee, are you? You're more like equipment that cleans up after the real workers. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Naomi watched as several people winced, their discomfort palpable. She was beginning to understand that Richard's cruelty toward her was having an unintended consequence. It was revealing to the entire workforce what kind of man their manager really was. Of course, Mr. Hale, Naomi replied, standing and gathering her lunch. I'll find somewhere else to eat. But Richard wasn't finished with his performance. You know what I don't understand, Carter? He blocked her path to the door, forcing her to look up at him. People like you always complain about not having opportunities, but look at you. Can't even dress professionally for a cleaning job. Naomi glanced down at her simple work clothes, practical pants and a company-issued polo shirt, exactly what every other maintenance worker wore. She realized this wasn't about her appearance at all. This was about Richard's need to feel superior, to have someone he could step on to elevate himself. I'll keep that in mind, she said quietly. As the days went on, Richard's behavior became increasingly brazen. During a morning shift meeting, he used Naomi as an example of what he called unskilled labor. Despite the fact that she wasn't even part of the meeting, she was simply cleaning nearby. See, this is what I mean about efficiency, Richard told the assembled supervisors, gesturing toward Naomi as she wiped down tables. Some people are meant to think, others are meant to do simple, repetitive tasks. It's just natural selection in the workplace. But while Richard was busy performing his superiority, Naomi was busy observing his incompetence. She watched him ignore safety protocols that she had tried to bring to his attention. She saw him cut corners on quality control to meet impossible deadlines. She witnessed him take credit for his subordinates' ideas while blaming them for his own mistakes. The chemical leak at Station 7 had grown worse, just as she had predicted. But rather than address the problem, Richard had simply moved some equipment to hide the stained concrete. When Tom from maintenance mentioned the strange smell in that area, Richard dismissed him with the same contempt he showed Naomi. If you spent less time making excuses and more time doing your job, maybe we wouldn't have these phantom problems, Richard had told Tom, who walked away shaking his head in frustration. Naomi began to notice other things too. Richard routinely arrived late and left early, but somehow his timesheets always showed full days. He held meetings during work hours to discuss his weekend golf games while criticizing workers for time theft when they took bathroom breaks. He had installed a new coffee machine in his office while denying requests to fix the broken water fountain that the floor workers relied on. The breaking point came during a routine inspection by OSHA representatives. Naomi watched from across the floor as Richard charmed the inspectors, steering them away from problem areas and feeding them practiced lies about safety protocols. Our safety record speaks for itself, she heard him tell the lead inspector. We haven't had a reportable incident in over 18 months, but Naomi knew better. She had seen the near-miss reports that Richard had buried, the injury claims he had pressured workers to withdraw, the safety suggestions he had ignored. She had documentation of every corner he had cut, every rule he had bent, every worker he had silenced. What Richard didn't know was that his behavior toward her wasn't happening in a vacuum. Every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every demonstration of his character was being carefully noted by someone who understood exactly what she was seeing. As Richard walked the inspectors past Station 7, carefully avoiding the area where the chemical leak continued to spread, Naomi made a mental note. The man who called her unskilled labor was about to discover just how much skill it took to properly evaluate leadership. That evening, Naomi sat in her upscale downtown apartment, a stark contrast to the humble image she projected at Pinnacle Manufacturing. The walls were lined with certificates and awards: Harvard MBA, Leadership Excellence recognition from Fortune 500 companies, testimonials from CEOs who had transformed their organizations based on her recommendations. Her laptop screen displayed a detailed report titled, Pinnacle Manufacturing Leadership Assessment Week 4. Dr. Naomi Carter wasn't just any consultant. She was the founder of Carter & Associates, one of the most respected organizational psychology firms in the country. Companies paid her six-figure fees to diagnose their leadership problems and recommend solutions. Her specialty was something she called ground-level assessment, evaluating leaders by observing how they treated the most vulnerable employees in their organization. The true measure of leadership, she had written in her best-selling book, isn't how someone behaves in the boardroom. It's how they treat the janitor when no one important is watching. Her phone buzzed with a text from her business partner, Dr. Jennifer Walsh. "How's the undercover work going? Board meeting is scheduled for next Friday." Naomi smiled as she typed back. "Subject is exceeding our worst-case scenarios. This will be an easy recommendation." The Pinnacle Manufacturing assignment had come through unusual channels. Margaret Thornton, the board chairwoman, had contacted Naomi personally after receiving multiple anonymous complaints about management culture. The company was struggling with high turnover, low morale, and a series of safety incidents that had escaped public attention but worried the insurance providers. "We need to know if our middle management is equipped to lead this company into the future," Margaret had explained during their confidential meeting. "But we can't do a traditional assessment. These people know how to perform when they're being watched. We need to see who they really are." That's when Naomi proposed her most ambitious undercover operation yet. For 6 weeks, she would work as a temporary janitor, invisible to the very people she was evaluating. The board members were the only ones who knew her true identity. Even HR believed she was exactly what she appeared to be. Now, 4 weeks into the assignment, her laptop contained a damning portrait of Richard Hale's leadership style. She had documented 17 separate incidents of workplace harassment, 12 safety violations he had ignored or covered up, and countless examples of the toxic culture he fostered through his behavior. But it wasn't just about Richard. Naomi had been evaluating the entire management structure, looking for both problems and potential solutions. She had identified several supervisors who showed promise, people like David Kim in quality control, who always treated workers with respect, and Maria Santos in HR, who genuinely tried to address employee concerns despite being overruled by her superiors. Her assessment went beyond just observing the managers. She had been studying the workers too, identifying natural leaders who were being overlooked because of their position in the hierarchy. Marcus, the young father on the production line, had shown exceptional problem-solving skills and earned the respect of his peers. Elena had developed informal mentoring relationships with newer employees, demonstrating the kind of emotional intelligence that effective leaders possessed. The chemical leak at Station 7 had become a perfect case study in Richard's leadership failures. Instead of addressing the problem when Naomi first reported it, he had dismissed her concerns and allowed the situation to worsen. By now, the leak had contaminated nearly 50 square feet of concrete, and Naomi suspected it was affecting the air quality in the adjacent work areas. Workers had been complaining of headaches and respiratory irritation, but Richard attributed these to seasonal allergies and refused to investigate. What made Richard's behavior even more problematic was how it affected the entire organizational culture. Naomi had observed other supervisors beginning to emulate his dismissive attitude toward lower-level employees. His casual cruelty was becoming normalized, creating a workplace where problems were ignored, feedback was unwelcome, and workers felt powerless to improve their conditions. But perhaps most damning was Richard's complete lack of self-awareness. He genuinely believed he was an effective leader. In her hidden recordings of management meetings, Naomi had heard him boast about his strong leadership style and his ability to keep workers in line. He saw his cruelty as strength and his dismissiveness as efficiency. As Naomi reviewed her notes, she felt a familiar mix of anger and professional satisfaction. Anger at the unnecessary suffering Richard caused, but satisfaction in knowing that her work would soon put an end to it. Her report would recommend not just Richard's removal, but a complete restructuring of the management hierarchy, with promotions for the natural leaders she had identified among the rank-and-file employees. The irony wasn't lost on her. The unskilled temp, that Richard dismissed so casually held the power to reshape his entire professional future. Every insult he had thrown at her, every moment of cruelty he had displayed, had become evidence in a report that would ultimately determine who stayed and who left. Tomorrow would bring new observations, new documentation of Richard's failures. But the game was already over. Richard just didn't know it yet. The morning of the client walkthrough, Pinnacle Manufacturing buzzed with nervous energy. Richard Hale strutted through the facility like a peacock, barking orders and making last-minute changes that only served to stress out his already anxious staff. The visitors were from Meridian Industries, a potential partner worth millions in contracts, and Richard was determined to make a perfect impression. "Carter!" he shouted across the production floor as Naomi mopped near the main entrance. "I don't want to see you or your cart anywhere near the tour route. Stay out of sight until these people are gone." "Yes, Mr. Hale," Naomi replied, though she made no move to leave. She had her own reasons for wanting to observe this particular tour, reasons that Richard would never suspect. The Meridian Industries delegation arrived promptly at 10 a.m., 5 impeccably dressed executives led by CEO Patricia Hendricks, a woman whose reputation for thorough due diligence was legendary in manufacturing circles. What Richard didn't know was that one of those executives, a quiet man in a navy suit who introduced himself as Consultant James Morrison, was actually Dr. James Morrison from Carter & Associates, Naomi's business partner and fellow leadership assessment expert. "Welcome to Pinnacle Manufacturing," Richard boomed, his voice echoing through the lobby. "I'm Richard Hale, Floor Manager and Operational Excellence Coordinator. I'll be personally conducting your tour today." As the group moved through the facility, Richard launched into his practice presentation, highlighting efficiency metrics and quality standards while carefully steering the visitors away from problem areas. Naomi followed at a discreet distance, ostensibly cleaning but actually observing every interaction. The tour proceeded smoothly until they reached the production floor, where Marcus was training 2 new employees on proper safety protocols. Richard's face darkened as he noticed the small group clustered around a workstation. "Excuse me for just a moment," Richard told the visitors with a forced smile. He strode over to Marcus, his voice carrying clearly across the floor. "What's this gathering about?" "We're trying to run a professional operation here. Just showing the new hires proper lifting technique, Mr. Hale," Marcus replied respectfully. "OSHA requires." "I know what OSHA requires," Richard snapped. "What I don't need is employees standing around chatting when we have important visitors. Get back to work, all of you." Naomi watched as the Meridian executives exchanged glances. Patricia Hendricks made a subtle note on her tablet, while James Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral. The real disaster occurred 20 minutes later, as the tour approached the break room area. Naomi was wiping down tables when she noticed the chemical smell from Station 7 had grown stronger. The leak she had tried to warn Richard about weeks ago was now affecting air quality throughout the adjacent areas, and she could see some of the Meridian visitors beginning to notice. "What's that smell?" asked one of the executives, a woman with silver hair who kept glancing towards Station 7. "Oh, that's just some cleaning chemicals," Richard laughed nervously. "You know how it is with industrial facilities. Sometimes the janitors get a little heavy-handed with the products." It was a lie, and Naomi knew it. But before she could consider her response, Richard's eyes locked onto her, and she saw the familiar cruel gleam that preceded his public humiliations. "Speaking of which," Richard said loudly, his voice carrying to everyone in the area, "Carter! Come over here!" Naomi's heart raced as she approached, pushing her cart. She could feel the eyes of the Meridian executives on her, including James Morrison, who was watching with intense interest. "This is exactly what I was talking about," Richard announced to the visitors, gesturing at Naomi like she was an exhibit. "Some people just don't understand proper chemical usage. Carter here probably used half a bottle of ammonia where a few drops would do." "Actually, Mr. Hale," Naomi said quietly, "I haven't used any ammonia products in this area today." Richard's face reddened at being contradicted in front of the visitors. "Don't give me excuses," he snarled. You people always have excuses. This is what happens when you hire unskilled labor from temp agencies. They don't have the intelligence to follow simple instructions. The silence that followed was deafening. Naomi could see the horror on Patricia Hendricks' face, the disgust in the other executives' expressions. James Morrison was staring at Richard with undisguised amazement, as if he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. Furthermore, Richard continued, oblivious to the damage he was doing. This is why proper workplace hierarchy exists. Some people are meant to think and lead, while others are meant to follow orders and clean up messes. It's just natural organizational structure. Mr. Hale. Patricia Hendricks interrupted, her voice ice cold. Perhaps we should continue the tour. But Richard wasn't finished with his performance. Of course, but I think it's important for you to understand how we maintain discipline and efficiency here. Carter, tell these executives what your job responsibilities are. Naomi looked directly at James Morrison, who gave her the slightest nod, a signal she had been waiting for. I observe, assess, and report on organizational effectiveness, she said clearly. Richard laughed harshly. See? She can't even describe mopping floors properly. Probably didn't finish high school. He turned to the executives with a conspiratorial smile. But she's cheap labor, and sometimes that's what you need for the simple jobs. The Meridian executives stood frozen, their faces reflecting various degrees of shock and revulsion. Patricia Hendricks was typing rapidly on her tablet, while James Morrison watched Richard with the fascination of a scientist studying a particularly interesting specimen. I think we've seen enough, Patricia said finally. Thank you for the tour, Mr. Hale. As the executives filed out, Richard beamed with satisfaction, completely unaware that he had just delivered the most damning performance of his career in front of the very people who would decide his fate. The boardroom on the 15th floor of Pinnacle Manufacturing's corporate tower was a temple of polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows. Margaret Thornton, the silver-haired board chairwoman, sat at the head of the imposing conference table, flanked by 6 other board members whose combined business experience spanned decades. The atmosphere was tense, electric with anticipation. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret announced, checking her watch. Our consultant should be arriving any moment to present her findings from the 6-week leadership assessment. At exactly 2 p.m., the door opened, and Naomi Carter entered, but not the Naomi that Richard Hale would recognize. Gone were the simple work clothes and cleaning cart. Instead, she wore a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of boardroom authority, her natural hair styled professionally, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Richard made in a month. The transformation was so complete that she seemed like an entirely different person. Dr. Carter. Margaret smiled warmly, rising to shake her hand. Thank you for your thorough work on this assessment. Please take your seat. Naomi moved to the head of the table opposite Margaret, her presence commanding immediate respect from everyone in the room. She opened her briefcase and extracted a thick report bound in the company's colors, along with her laptop and a small recording device. Before we begin, she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to addressing corporate executives, I want to emphasize that what you're about to hear represents one of the most comprehensive leadership failures I've documented in 15 years of organizational consulting. The board members leaned forward, their expressions grave. These were people who had built and acquired companies, who understood that leadership problems could destroy decades of progress in months. The subject of our primary assessment, floor manager Richard Hale, has demonstrated a pattern of behavior that represents not just poor leadership, but active toxicity that threatens the very foundation of your organizational culture. Naomi activated her laptop, and the wall-mounted screen displayed a timeline of incidents. Over 6 weeks, I documented 43 separate instances of employee harassment, 18 safety violations that were ignored or covered up, and systematic abuse of power that has created a hostile work environment. The room was silent except for the quiet clicking of her laptop keys as she navigated through her presentation. But the numbers only tell part of the story. What you need to understand is how Mr. Hale's behavior affects every level of your organization. She played audio recordings of Richard's most damaging moments, his cruel dismissal of the chemical leak warning, his public humiliation of workers, his boasting about keeping employees in line. With each clip, the board members' expressions grew darker. The chemical leak at Station 7, Naomi continued, which I first reported on my 4th day, has now contaminated nearly 100 square feet of facility space and is affecting air quality. Mr. Hale's response was to dismiss the concern and hide the evidence from OSHA inspectors. Board member Robert Chin, the company's longest-serving director, shook his head in disgust. The liability alone could bankrupt us if this gets out. It gets worse, Naomi said, advancing to the next slide. Yesterday's incident with the Meridian Industries delegation represents perhaps the most catastrophic leadership failure I've ever witnessed. She played the audio from the client walkthrough, Richard's voice clearly audible as he humiliated her in front of potential partners worth millions. The board members visibly cringed at his words about unskilled labor and natural organizational structure. I received a call from Patricia Hendricks this morning, Margaret said quietly. Meridian Industries has withdrawn from negotiations. She specifically cited concerns about management culture and employee treatment as their reason. The financial impact hit the room like a physical blow. Several board members exchanged worried glances, calculating the lost revenue and damaged reputation. However, Naomi continued, my assessment wasn't limited to identifying problems. I also identified exceptional leadership potential among your current workforce that's being completely overlooked. She displayed profiles of Marcus, Elena, David Kim from Quality Control, and Maria Santos from HR. These individuals demonstrate natural leadership abilities, emotional intelligence, and the respect of their peers. They represent the future of effective management at Pinnacle Manufacturing. As Naomi spoke, the boardroom door suddenly burst open. Richard Hale strode in, his face flushed with anger and confusion. What the hell is going on here? He demanded, looking around the room. Margaret, I got a message that there was some kind of emergency meeting about the Meridian contract. Why wasn't I informed about? He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes finally focusing on the woman at the head of the table. For a moment, he seemed unable to process what he was seeing. The confident executive in the expensive suit looked familiar, but his brain refused to make the connection. Carter? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Dr. Naomi Carter, she replied calmly, rising from her chair. Founder and CEO of Carter and Associates, organizational psychology consultant, and for the past 6 weeks, your employee evaluation specialist. Richard's face went through a spectrum of colors, from red to white to green, as the full reality of his situation crashed over him like a tsunami. Every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every moment of humiliation he had inflicted on her had been documented by someone with the power to destroy his career. You've been watching me, he said, his voice hollow with the realization of his complete and utter defeat. That's exactly what you hired me to do, Naomi replied, her smile sharp as a blade. The silence in the boardroom stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Richard Hale stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The man who had spent weeks calling Naomi unskilled labor was now face to face with a Harvard MBA who held his professional future in her hands. Sit down, Richard, Margaret Thornton commanded, her voice carrying decades of boardroom authority. Dr. Carter was just finishing her presentation about your performance over the past 6 weeks. Richard stumbled to an empty chair, his legs seemingly unable to support him. His eyes darted frantically around the room, taking in the grim faces of the board members, the damning evidence displayed on the screen, and most devastating of all, the woman he had systematically humiliated now sitting in the position of ultimate power. I don't understand, he stammered. This has to be some kind of mistake. Some kind of setup. The only mistake, said board member Robert Chin coldly, was our failure to identify your leadership deficiencies sooner. Dr. Carter's assessment has revealed behaviors that put this company at serious legal and financial risk. Naomi reopened her laptop with deliberate calm. Would you like me to replay some of your more memorable quotes, Mr. Hale? Perhaps your thoughts on natural organizational structure or your description of certain employees as equipment that cleans up after real workers? Richard's face crumpled as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. Every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every moment of petty tyranny had been carefully documented by someone he had dismissed as beneath his notice. The chemical leak at Station 7, Margaret continued, which you ignored despite Dr. Carter's warnings, has now contaminated nearly the entire East Wing. Environmental Services estimates cleanup costs at over $200,000. The potential OSHA fines could reach 7 figures. And the Meridian Industries contract, added board member Sarah Walsh, her voice icy with controlled fury, worth $12 million annually, has been terminated specifically because of your behavior during yesterday's tour. Richard tried to speak, but only managed a strangled sound. The numbers were crushing, hundreds of thousands in cleanup costs, millions in lost revenue, and that was before considering the lawsuits that would inevitably follow when employees learned how their safety concerns had been ignored. However, Naomi interjected, her tone shifting slightly. My assessment wasn't solely focused on identifying failures. I also documented exceptional leadership potential among your current workforce. She clicked to a news slide showing detailed profiles. Marcus Williams from the production floor demonstrated crisis management skills when he prevented a safety incident last Tuesday. Elena Rodriguez has been informally mentoring new employees with remarkable success. David Kim in quality control and Maria Santos in HR have both shown the kind of ethical leadership this company desperately needs. Margaret nodded approvingly. Dr. Carter's recommendations for restructuring our management hierarchy are both comprehensive and compelling. Marcus Williams will be promoted to floor supervisor, with a salary increase to $65,000 annually. Naomi announced, watching Richard's face as she spoke. Elena Rodriguez will become training coordinator, overseeing all new employee orientation. David Kim will be elevated to quality control manager, and Maria Santos will lead our new employee relations department. Each promotion was another nail in Richard's professional coffin. The people he had dismissed as inferior were being elevated to positions that would have been his pathway to advancement. As for your position, Mr. Hale, Margaret said with finality, your employment with Pinnacle Manufacturing is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you out after you surrender your access cards and company equipment. Richard finally found his voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. You can't do this. I have rights. I have a contract. Your contract, said Robert Chin, sliding a thick folder across the table, contains several clauses regarding conduct detrimental to company interests. Dr. Carter's report provides ample justification for immediate termination without severance. As if summoned by some invisible signal, 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. Richard looked around the room one final time, perhaps hoping to find some trace of sympathy or support. He found only cold professional judgment. The irony, Mr. Hale, Naomi said as he was led toward the door, is that you were absolutely right about one thing. Some people are meant to lead, and others are meant to follow. You just had the roles reversed. 6 months later, Pinnacle Manufacturing was featured in Industry Week magazine as a model of progressive workplace culture. The article highlighted the company's innovative approach to identifying leadership talent at every level of the organization. Marcus Williams was quoted extensively about the importance of treating every employee with dignity and respect. The article made no mention of Richard Hale, who had found employment at a small auto parts supplier in another state, at a significantly reduced salary, and with no management responsibilities. Naomi Carter framed the magazine cover and hung it in her office, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful tool for change is simply giving people the respect they deserve and the opportunity to show what they're truly capable of achieving. The chemical leak at Station 7 had been fully remediated, the Meridian Industries contract had been renewed under new leadership, and the woman who had been dismissed as just a temp had transformed an entire organization, proving that true leadership isn't about the title you hold, but about the impact you make on the people around you.